Welcome to the Mountain Bike Coaching Podcast, Donuts and Bikes. I'm Kristian.
And I'm Paul.
And we're here to discuss the techniques and skills we use to progress our coaches, our riders, and ourselves to be more confident, competent, unlock performance, and have more fun on our mountain bikes. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to this second episode of the Mountain Bike Coaching Podcast. Thinking back on the previous episode, the slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And Paul, we talked a lot about kind of the 80 to 90% kind of concept of training in that zone, slowing down a bit from going all out and some of the benefits from that. And, you know, as we know, and as we've been talking about it since the recording of that episode, man, there are times when you got to put it all on the line. You know, if you want to win a race, you've got to not just give 90%. You've got to go all out, 100, 110%. What are some coaching thoughts on working with your racers in that moment? When, you know, once we're there and we're ready to win, like what are some ideas that come up for you?
Yeah, cool. Good question. I think it really depends on who you are and where you're at in your riding or racing career. Like if you're a top pro, say you're like Amaury or Loic, or Laurie, Greenland, or Tani or Pom Pom, like you're at that level, you're top 10, 5 in the world, top 20 in the world. You've raced for so long and you have such a high skill set and strength and conditioning and all those kind of other factors, that essentially over time you've learned how to race at say 100% and still create more consistency and essentially not blow up. Like, long story short, it's really difficult to do a race run at your 100% max effort and not make a big enough mistake that causes you to crash. So you probably heard, like, all of us here, like at the end of a downhill race, if you're watching the Red Bull and the World Cups, you know, racers often say, like, Greg or Pom Pom or whoever it is, they're like, you know, these days you have to race at like 100% to win. It's just so competitive. Everyone's going so fast. Yeah, you have to try your best. But the question riders and racers need to ask themselves in that sort of junior category or amateur category or whatever it is, i.e., you know, not the top 50 in the world, is if I take that same approach, will it be successful for me? And long story short, just because, you know, Amaury is riding at 105%, which he often sort of admits to, he's like, he rides, you know, balls out to win a race, and that's partly his style. But he's that's a craft that he's developed, and over time there would have been times during his career where he had to learn how to win or how to get a smooth race run at his 80%, at his 90%. And that's the starting point for most riders, is you can't like suddenly go to a race, show up and ride your 100% speed, your 100% effort, and expect not to crash. Like, that's a really hard thing to do. So I think that's mostly what the last podcast was, we were trying to get into and discuss with, like, for most racers, most riders, you need to go through this process of slow is smooth, smooth is fast. You need to understand what are the skills you need to develop so that you can gradually increase your natural speed over time. You can gradually increase your average speed over time so that when you are racing, you're getting good results by racing at 80% or 90% effort. And then that's a fine art, that's a fine craft to develop. And then over time, you can, once you've learned how to do that and not crash and not wipe out and get consistent results, then you can gradually crank up that speed. So essentially, even if you think of, like, we're using Amaury as an example, like, even at his 100% effort, over time, he has got to a point where he can still be smooth And in some ways, in that 100% effort race, he's still choosing places to be smart, to slow down that tiny bit so he's smoother through here, or just back off a little bit there because there's too much risk and too much time lost if you make a mistake. So I guarantee, even though in that like 100% effort run from him, there's still probably little micro sections in that race run where he's prioritizing smoothness or margin of error for all out speed. But yeah, I don't know where that sits, but I think at the end of the day, it's all about a process, and a process that takes a long time to dial in.
I like that idea of an intentional process of understanding, as you said, like, where are you in this in your racing development? You know, what category? I think that's a really critical thing for riders and coaches to realize. And the other thought that comes to mind here is focusing on results in that process can sometimes be a distraction, you know, for what the skills are that you're trying to learn and trying to actually progress through, as opposed to like, I want to be on the podium on this race, you know, in Cat 1 or whatever it is.
Yeah, and that's super common. Like, too early, too soon, or too young at age, people are focusing on results, and that causes them to ride faster than they're able to manage. Like, if you look at any amateur racer and you look at why they crash, it's very common that they crash because they were simply going too fast in that section for their skill set or their experience set. They haven't, just trying to go fast just isn't necessarily the best place to start your racing career. I guess, in a nutshell.
Yeah, and
I know that sounds kind of backwards, but that's precisely why people crash, is that they're trying to go too fast when they haven't kind of got to that point yet.
Well, yeah, and if you take that same concept and remove racing from it and just put back in just mountain biking in general, I think the same thing applies. Yeah. You know, if not honoring that process, and, you know, focusing, like, if you're focusing on the results of, I want to ride X trail at X speed, and you don't have the skills for it, and then you're setting yourself up, you know, or a coach is, you know, potentially setting them their student up for failure. So
I've always thought of practicing though, it's like just a general approach to coaching and skills development. And, you know, whilst you can say like build gradually, like one other useful way, and we talked about it in the previous episode, is like, on the flip side, coaching is all about flip sides and bracketing, and you try this approach and then you actually flip it and you try the opposite approach. It's just how much you do each of which. And typically what happens is, when people are trying to learn to race, they try to learn to go faster by going faster, but that's the only approach they use. What they really should be doing is a balanced approach where they spend a lot of time trying to focus on slow is smooth and trusting that slow is smooth and that will be fast. So they just need to balance their approach. But typically riders just tend to like, I want to get fast, I'm just going to ride fast. And they just need to realize that's one approach to achieving that goal. That's it, but it's not the only approach.
Cool. I think that's a fantastic segue into our next topic here, which is the kind of the intersection between coaching, working with riders in their process, in their progression, and the medium that we use, which is the trail, right? And so what is the relationship between how we coach and the terrain that we're using, the way that the trail is built? And I'm excited for listeners to carry on and listen to this episode.
The topic for today's podcast is basically why trail builders should coach, and then why coaches should build trails. I've talked about this with trail builders and with coaches in the past, and it's definitely a topic that I'm personally passionate about and a big fan of. And having had a lot of trail builders on instructor courses over the years, you know, when they're on an instructor course and they're learning how to coach, and you see a lot of light bulbs kind of come on as they're learning how a beginner rides or a novice or an intermediate rides, and what they can and can't do, and how does that level of rider look at a trail. And even on more advanced instructor courses where we're training instructors to teach jumping or drops, and the trail builders suddenly realizing like, oh, this explains why I can't build jumps that way. I need to maybe try and build jumps this way, or what is the shape or the steepness or the size of the jump. So I think that there's a lot of synergy between, ultimately the role of a coach is to help improve someone's mountain bike experience. And if you think of trail builders, it's kind of the same goal. Like the ultimate goal of both a trail builder and a coach is to make biking more accessible, more fun, more challenging at times, but more challenging and safe. So the trail builders and coaches, at the end of the day, they have a lot of similar goals in mind. A good place to start is for you, Kristian, is you have a healthy and extensive background in trail building down there in North Carolina. So I just wanted to sort of ask you off the top, for our listeners, maybe tell us a little bit about your background as the trail boss of Rocky Knob MTB Park in North Carolina, and maybe just a bit of your history and background with trail building, and obviously linking that to coaching.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely fascinating topic, Paul. I started becoming aware of like trail stewardship when I worked for the North Carolina Outward Bound School. And so I was leading 14-day expeditions in Pisgah. And part of those courses was doing some trail service work, trail maintenance work on some trails. And I, had grown up riding BMX bikes and digging jumps and ditches and that kind of thing, but had never really paid attention to like the trail in and of itself until started working with it for the Outward Bound School. And some of the other staff there had much more experience in trail building, and learning from them about the relationship between the rider and the environment, and starting to see what the impacts are long term, became like a huge fascination point for me, and then started to see like the effort that people can put into proper maintenance, and the values they get from learning about the environment, learning about working with each other, and being stewards, right? Being stewards of something that is the trail that's going to be around for a while. And so that guess kind of started my career with trail building back to summer 2000. And that led to building my own trail at the base camp inside of Pisgah National Forest, where the Outward Bound School was, and bringing out a trail, the trail building guru of the area, and a former Outward Bound instructor. And I was pretty excited to show him this trail that I spent most of a winter building, and we walked up and down it, and he was kind of stoic, and I got to the bottom, and I'm like, "What do you think, man? What do you isn't this awesome?" And he's like, "God's honest truth, this is absolute shit. This violates every rule of trail building." And I'm like, "What? I can't. No, come on! I put so much time into this. I put so much time into building this." And so he kind of took me under his wing and started working for his trail building company, and kind of learning all the what goes into actually creating a trail, and spent quite a bit of time doing that. And eventually, fast forward to the development of Rocky Knob here in Boone. Is our first mountain bike trail system that was created just for mountain bikes in our area, in our county. We've got Pisgah National Forest, but nearby that we all ride in. But at the time, there weren't any actual true mountain biking trails in the modern sense within our county. And I was selected to be the trail boss for the park, and in that process, we started developing the trails, and pretty early on in that, saw the concept of progression really kick in. Like people were getting better simply by riding at the park, like having this consistent place to come ride, and wanting to ride more difficult features
Yeah.
eventually jumps. And, during that process of building all these trails and seeing all these, dirt jump kids at Appalachian want to come out, and at the university, want to come out and ride and dig jumps, and started
Yeah.
realizing that, like, understanding the skills to mountain biking were crucial in how we're going to build a progression based park. If you don't quite understand, like, what makes a beginner rider different from an intermediate in terms of their needs, it's going to be really difficult to truly build a progression system for those riders.
Yeah. I think where you live is a really good example. Like, because I remember coaching in North Carolina um, in the late 90s, like early 2000s. And on the property where we ran our little mountain bike school, like, we were able to build all our own trails because it was their land, it was private land. And as soon as we went in and we developed like specific trails for the kids to learn on, the whole mountain bike option just became infinitely more popular because A, it was easier and more fun, and then B, it was less sketchy, like kids were crashing less. But then it was such a contrast. We would kind of go out of that zone near Brevard, and then we'd go into either DuPont or Pisgah, and where a lot of the trails, as you mentioned, weren't mountain bike specific trails. They're just sort of natural trails. A lot of them were sort of created by animals or horses or walkers. And you could see how the progression suddenly became so much more difficult because all of a sudden they could kind of either ride that trail or they couldn't. And the trail didn't allow for anyone to sort of progress up to it. We had to do all the homework back at camp and get the skills up. And then gradually we could piece together, well, these kids could do this trail, but these kids can't. And then these kids could do that trail. And it was amazing. I mean, don't get me wrong. It was amazing. We found a spectrum of trails for most skill levels, but it definitely made the barrier of entry so much more challenging for the coaches because there had to be so much more kind of planning and deliberate sort of skills development before you could even get some of the kids to Pisgah or to DuPont. Like, speaking to your background, like, can you think of some specific examples where you've been building trails and suddenly you've kind of thought, well, hang on a minute, this isn't for me. This trail is actually for another type of rider or another ability level rider, and then you've had to either tone it down or change it or...
Oh, for sure. And what you just described is basically the current history of Rocky Knob Park. For the past 12 years, we have been trying to make things easier. That this is you've been to Rocky Knob. It's an incredibly rocky place. It's trail builders kind of come there and
there's some gnarly stuff there too. Like there's some proper serious trails there. Like
there are, because the terrain allows for it. It's very rocky. The soil drains really well. We can build really steep things, and we made a decision early on in development of the park that we were okay with saying there are no beginner trails here.
Yeah.
Because the cost to put in a true green trail would be astronomical because of how rocky it is. And back then in 2010, we didn't quite have the understanding of how do you really change the landscape to do this. Now we're using explosives to move rocks. And doing all sorts of new techniques that we can do that. But to your point, though, one of the things that I did when started looking at our entry trail, like we have a 1.5 mile loop that's the first trail out of the trailhead, and wanted to make this easier, more inviting, more accessible for more people. And the thing that I did was to go around it and look at it from a skills perspective. And the place that I started was really thinking about the idea of, like, that we talk about with trail scanning and line selection. is grade, obstacles, and trail surface.
Yeah.
And how do those things stack up either for or against a rider? And when in the coaching world, we teach how to be aware of those things to influence then our choices that we make, right, with our riders.
Yeah.
And then here, flipping it around from a trail building perspective, there were a couple turns where the radius was tight.
Yeah.
The climbing turns, the steepness, was at a very steep grade. The surface was loose, and there were numerous obstacles. And so you put all those things together, and even if the rest of the trail is, a light blue maybe or a dark green, all of a sudden that one zone, because of those characteristics, bump it up several difficulty notches.
Yeah.
Right. And so then using those ideas, then how do we redesign this one thing to flatten out the grade, increase the radius, get rid of the obstacles, and harden the surface?
So in that example, you really feel like what helped your decision making as a trail builder was that insight from your coaching, your skills coaching, and just, and not just, and because of that it's really about knowing what that experience will be for the rider and not for you. Like trying to see it through the lens of, if I had that student last week that's fairly new to it and they were riding this, like what would their experience be like on the trail? And so is that the link for you that you think
absolutely
helps you make those trail building decisions?
Absolutely. As soon as I started really like course conducting PMBI and really like digging deep into this and how we teach these things, it transformed how I build trails and how I steward trails. And the if you think back historically, when you and I were first learning to ride mountain bikes in the mountains
in the 1950s.
Exactly, right. Ages and ages ago.
Yeah.
It was accepted that there are going to be areas where you get off and you walk your bike.
Right? Yeah.
There's just a hike. That's part of mountain biking. This is the hike a bike section.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that concepts, I think, from some older school trail builders, like still lingers a bit. We're like, this part is going to be hard because that's what mountain biking is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And switching lenses to the coaching perspective, you have to ask, well, why is it hard?
Yeah.
From the rider's perspective, what is it about this that's making it difficult? And what can we do to make sure that it's within the person that we're trying to serve? Like, who's this trail for?
Yeah.
I really like that question. And it also historically, when you think about trail building, before it was really a profession for mountain bikers, it was, most of these trails were built by passionate riders that wanted to go out and see something built. They've your area is home to just so many amazing trails that an individual or two just wanted to put in.
Yeah.
And it's because they wanted to ride that and it was for them. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the podcast. If you want to learn more about us, please check out our first episode, which digs into who we are, what we do, and our background in coaching and mountain bike industry. You can also check us out on Instagram at Donuts and Bikes, or at our podcast, the Mountain Bike Coaching Podcast.buzzsprout.com. And now back to the show.
Yeah, and I think that's a good, place to go in this conversation. Like I always think, like, what are some things that trail builders, and when we say trail builders, what we really mean is like sanctioned, trained, certified. They have the permits, they have the paperwork, they have the permission in place. We're really talking about legit trail builders here, not so much as rogue trail builders. We can always kind of separate those into a different conversation later on. But in that context of trail builders, legit trail builders, what I see they do really well is, if you compare like 2022 with say 2002 or 1992, is they're building engaging, fun trails, like the level of not just difficult trails, but safe, difficult trails that we're seeing grow at the moment in the industry is, I think it's at an all-time high. And that's something, trail builders can be congratulated for, because I think it's a huge component of what's growing the sport right now is the quality of the trails and the diversity of the trails. It's not just, if I think back to when I first moved to Whistler, like 16, 17 years ago, or whenever it was. And it's still a little bit like that these days, but the most of the trails were steep, gnarly, technical, and it was sort of, you can ride it or you can't. And it was a pretty hardcore scene. So it was fantastic if you were a certain level of rider. But if you were looking to get into the sport, if you were coming back into the sport after an injury, it made it very much a sort of a do or die approach to biking. Whereas, you fast forward to now and there's more blues and greens in Whistler than there ever have been. But that is something we're still working on in this community. We're still trying to focus on easier blacks or grays, I like to call them, or dark blues. So we're trying to find a balance between blues and blacks. And then more interesting blues. And maybe that's a good question to ask is I mean, if you look back the last 10 years and you look back at either rogue trail builders or legit trail builders, a lot of the time these trail builders are passionate people and they're spending a lot of effort. Like, trail building is hard. Like, it's physically, mentally tiring. They're spending a lot of time. They're often either not getting paid, or if they are getting paid, it's not a lot of money. So it makes sense to me that they're going to build a trail that they want to ride. And in the short term, that's amazing because we get a really sweet black trail or maybe a sweet double black. But then in the long term, it starts to make the sport a little bit too elitist. And I think that's the shift we started to see the last 5-10 years, is just trail builders understanding that, like, not every trail I'm going to build is going to be for me. And then now that we're getting more and more trail advocacy, more and more financing for trail building, we're starting to see more and more paid professional trail builders that potentially they're spending most of their time building trails for other people, building greens, building blues, or building trails in areas where they don't live. Or building a style of trail that maybe that trail builder isn't into. Maybe they love the flow trails and they're building a tech trail, or vice versa. So I think what's new right now, or I shouldn't say new, but newer in the trail building side of things right now, is we're getting trail builders for the first time are spending a lot more time building a lot more trails that they're not necessarily going to personally ride. So can you maybe talk to that?
Yeah, totally.
Point in terms of your experience with it or working with other trail builders, and then obviously from that coaching.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're spot on here. Is that in the trail building world today, the idea of growing the sport it's really catching on, of really making sure that there's a full spectrum of trails, a whole that are interesting. And that you want to ride. And I think something that comes to mind in your area, in the Alice Lakes area, the Leave of Absence Trail, right next to Rupert. It's a blue, but it's a progression-based blue. Where you've got this reputation of Squamish trails and all the slab videos and all this, and it, like, if you're just gnarly stuff and which is all really cool, but then how do you get there? And then that's why, there
needs to be a ladder up to that, a safe ladder,
but also a fun ladder. And that's why I think we're seeing, a bit of a renaissance in blue trails right now, or at least I hope we are, because that's where, percentage wise, the vast majority of riders are. If you look at just the people that are getting into the sport, because of the equipment and the access we have now, people are able to get into the blue that blue terrain very quickly. And there's a lot of robust blue trails around. That one comes to mind. And a couple other points here is if you think about Cayuga, the Camp Cayuga in Hendersonville. I don't know if we rode their green trail, but there's a green trail off the top called
I think we did ride
Evergreen.
We rode all those rad ones. They were sick.
But it's this masterfully built green trail where a green rider, and when you go there, you see people on hybrid bikes riding this sometimes, and very small kids can coast down this really fun green flowy trail. But you get an advanced rider on it, and all of a sudden there's doubles and triples everywhere, and the corners become just very conducive to like really precise skill. So you're starting to see things like that. And the other thing that I'm starting to see as well is the idea of predictability and consistency within a trail. And that speaks directly to the skills theme that we're talking about here. And the Hemlock Trail at Cayuga, one of those blacks, the natural blacks that we rode, where as soon as you drop in, there's a handful of features that are going to teach you what this trail is all about. And it's so predictable that
it's that kind of litmus test in the first 15 seconds. 20 seconds of the trail.
That idea of a qualifier has been around for a long time, of like, there's some sort of feature at the top that limits you from going into that trail if that's not your thing. However, I think builders these days are expanding on that, not just building a single feature, but giving you a snapshot of what's to come and what kind of skills are going to be required for the given trail. And the predictability and consistency then for the rider creates a wider zone of safety where there's not.
Yeah, I like the way you say that. Like, I kind of think of it like margin of error. Like, you can have a double black diamond trail, like the hardest trail rating there is, but it can still be safe. But you could have a blue trail that's not built well and could be super sketchy and has a high consequence and a low margin of error. And I might prefer actually to go ride the double black
because of the consistency and predictability. If you're getting surprised because you can't see a drop or whatever that's coming up, even if it's not, if on a blue trail, then you've got your margin goes way down.
So I guess what you're saying is, like, what you've seen in recent times is that the more these trail builders have spent building greens and building blues, they're basically getting better at it. They're understanding what makes a good or a bad green trail, what makes a good or a bad blue trail, and they're basically just getting better at building these more entry level intermediate.
Yeah, figuring out turn radius, the length of grade reversals for rollers, and all of that is hyper defined these days. And the other piece that is very exciting is that there's now value from the builders and the riding community for the greens and the blues, right? I think for quite a while it was just it's about the more difficult things.
Yeah. I mean, would you agree, like in earlier years, maybe 10 years ago or whatever, like the culture of mountain biking was definitely, I think, was a little more gnarly, a little more elitist. It was less open to newer riders, different types of riders. And partly that came from the fact that the trail builders back then were more or less building trails for themselves, and they were almost using it as a way to progress their own riding. And that's how, like, so many good trails and so much good riding has happened in the sport. But that kind of perpetuated this barrier to entry, because the people that were building the trails weren't necessarily getting paid a lot. And so they invested a lot of their time in building trails they wanted to ride, or building trails that were going to push their riding. And inherently that kind of created this sort of extreme culture within mountain biking. But now that we're just further down the road, aren't we? We've got more history of learning how to build trails, how not to build trails, and we're starting to see a more balance of just greens, blues, dark blues, light blacks, double blacks, or red blacks if you're in Europe or elsewhere. And to me, what I'm seeing is that not only is it lowering the entry level into the sport, but for me as an expert rider and as a coach, it's not like every time I ride, I want to go ride a black or a double black. It's not that every time I ride, I want to be pushed. Like sometimes I just want to go on a ride. I just want to go on a fun ride. And something I miss in Whistler and something I love having in North Carolina, especially trails like around Nantahala and the Sally Loops, it's just like fun blue trails that are fast. I don't have to be like on my A game. I can make the trail challenging by like, bunny hopping over this or trying to double those rollers or trying to go inside on the berm. There's so many ways I can make that blue trail challenging and even push my skill set, perhaps more than I might push my skill set on a black or a double black trail. And I think that culture is starting to seep in where, it used to be all about harder terrain and pushing your skills and getting more extreme. And now it can just be mountain biking can kind of be anything. It doesn't have to be this gnarly thing. It can just be a leisurely Sunday ride with your mates and then go for a cup of tea and a piece of cake.
Yeah.
And if you're in the UK, if you're in Canada, you're probably going to go for a beer. But does that make sense? Have you kind of felt the same thing where like there isn't this pressure to always ride harder trails now? Like you could just, hey, why don't we go ride this blue trail? Like this is just as fun as that.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking to is the difference between an exclusivity and inclusivity. Like historically,
exactly.
our sport and the trails themselves has been very exclusive. You need the right equipment.
Yeah.
You need to know where to go.
Yeah.
You need to have suffered through getting to ride the gnarly things, right? And then somebody's got to tell you, where to go. Here's the next thing, and that's as we, especially in COVID times, we're seeing so many more people wanting to be on bikes, and this idea of making things more inclusive is really starting to take hold. And so the side benefits of that, or all the benefits of that, are, it's not just being more open to more people, but also just to provide a whole bunch of different experiences, for every rider, right?
Exactly. And I think that's what I think all of us are seeing these days is that increased inclusivity. And that's where I think the magic is happening, where it's sort of a positive feedback loop, right? If we can get more riders into the sport, more diversity into the sport, guess what else comes? We get more support, more funding. That goes back into the trails. And depending on where you live, that may be more true or less true. But I travel a lot with coaching. As you know, like I train instructors all around the US and Australia and Europe and UK and East West Canada. And I've been to a lot of bike parks, a lot of communities, a lot of trail networks. And, it's growing everywhere. And the thing I love to see that's growing is not just the amount of riders, but the diversity of riders. And I've always said for a long time, like, for better or worse, but I've always said, like, if you have a family and the dad rides, it's quite often, in my experience, from what I've seen, is that a little bit more historic, is that the dad rides and then that's it, the dad rides. But if you see a family where the mum rides, then everyone in that family rides. Now the kids are into it and everyone's into it. So it's like trying to get new riders into the sport where, regardless of age, race, or gender. I think that's the key. Diversity is the key, because it just brings in so many more people, so many more ideas, and from that we get more funding. And I think that's where the magic happens. If we have more funding but more people and more ideas, trail builders can see that. If there's only one kind of person riding a trail, chances are that trail builder is going to have a pretty limited view of how to build a trail. But if there's a lot of different people, a lot of different ability levels riding the trail, now all of a sudden the trail builder has a lot more lenses to kind of look through in terms of how could this trail work well, what might make this trail not work well. And the outcome ultimately is going to be a much higher level of trail in my mind.
Well, yeah.
Does that sort of resonate with you?
Absolutely. And I think to expand on that, as soon as a builder within any given trail system is taking that approach, then their ability to build support within the community has just exponentially increased. Right. So not just by the concept of social sustainability, it's one of the three forms of sustainability for trails. But more people are coming to use the trail. But then when you go to your county government or your town and you're asking for support or financially, and you're able to demonstrate to this to the politicians, here's who's using these trails.
Here's how these trails are positively impacting our entire community.
Exactly. It's not just a bunch of dudes in the woods on bikes.
Yeah, it's not just one guy saying, "Hey, can I have some more money to build some trails for some other guys?" It's far more holistic.
That's one of the ways that we've really gained support for our park here, is the community aspect of it. And it's the fact that we have kids riding and families riding, families traveling for vacation and choosing to come to the park. When the people that are sitting at the politicians' table voting on whether do we support this or not, then those are facts. It's hard to deny that. And plus, in our area, we're a tourist destination, and most of our funding from here comes from that tourism fund, and it's a win-win because we get to fund it from those dollars, and locals get to use it as well.
And I think that's such a great point. Like if you're going to your local government, council, whatever it is, and you're trying to raise money for trails, if you can prove that this is going to impact the kids, it's going to impact men, women, old, young, whoever, different socioeconomic backgrounds, like these trails can be a resource for everyone in the community. Clearly the council or the government's going to look more favorable on that. But then the outcome too, or I guess one of the prerequisites for that is the trail builders involved. They intrinsically have to be aware of okay, if we're going to put in a proposal for, maybe they just want to build, I really want to build this black trail. I really want to build this jump trail. But why don't I put in a proposal for a green, a blue, and a black? And that way they're kind of leveraging the green and the blue trail. What they really want to build is that jump trail, is that black trail or that tech line. But now all of a sudden they've created more work for themselves. They've created more resources for the local community, everyone in the community, not just the guys and girls that are going to go shred the black trail. But then at the end of the day, they still get what they want. They still get to build that gnarly trail that she wants to ride or he wants to ride.
And I think you're hitting on a really important part about a holistic view of the trails, in the sense that if you're putting in a proposal to build something and it's just green or it's just black, like you're really missing out on a full build out. And we've seen this here dramatically with the building of our double black, and it was we built it at the same time that we built our green entry level trail, and the idea was to really hone in on purpose skill based progression. So, and not just a progression of that's your green and that's the blue, but really this is a green because of this is for beginners. Here's where intermediates are going to develop. And then the thing
Yeah.
that's really has struck me is that the most difficult trail, the Black Forest Trail, with all the big rock rolls and all that, has become an aspirational trail for people that have grown up at the park. Now, I've literally seen kids grow up at the park talking about, from being 8, 9, 10 years old, knowing that trail exists, and one day they want to ride it.
That's
And
so
we had
cool.
a group of 8th graders, ride it by themselves, after having grown up there and learning how to take appropriate, or just using decision making to know when their skills had reached the point that they could go try that trail. And I think that's some of the evidence of how important skills understanding is for trail communities.
Thanks for listening, everyone. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify. Make sure you listen in to the end of the show where we reveal this week's Donut of the Week. All right, let's get back to the show.
Yeah, because if you dial in that green and blue trail, because you understand how those riders can or can't ride, you're going to create riders that come back.
Exactly.
They're going to come back, and then they're going to get to a point where they will ride that black or that double black. If we jump in and we build the green and the blues, but we don't quite dial it in, potentially we're going to lose that ridership from the community, and then we won't be able to have the sustainable funds to build more black trails or build more double blacks. And I think, and it kind of brings me to an idea or a point where for me, it's like sometimes, you know what it feels like when there's a good blue trail or a good green trail, because there's a high level rider, like I mentioned earlier, you can still have a lot of fun on it and you can still push your skills on it. And I've often thought, like, sometimes we trip ourselves up when we label a blue trail an intermediate trail, because now we've just kind of put out the word that, like, that's for intermediate riders. And then we label a black trail or a red or a black or a double black trail advanced or expert. And that's for advanced expert riders. But the reality is advanced or expert rider can ride any trail, right? And even an intermediate rider might be able to start to ride some red or black or double black trails. It's a lot more fluid than just like blue trails for intermediates and black trails for advanced. And that kind of takes me to the point of coaching, where, like, we always say in coaching, like, minimum terrain, maximum technique, and then in that kind of skill acquisition, that kind of emerging phase when we're learning new skills, we take our student, we dial down the terrain and we make it a little easier so they can try new movement patterns, try some drills, try some new techniques, and change basically their riding for the better, try and improve it. So in that emerging kind of consistent phase of that skill development, minimum terrain so we can dial in maximum technique. But then as they move towards that kind of autonomous, and then proficient stage of skill development where they're looking for that mastery, well, that's when we increase the terrain and we'll apply things now. Okay, we've learned how to pump, or we've learned how to pre-hop. Now let's take it to that black trail and we'll try and use this technique on those features that we looked at earlier, right? And so as a coach, we know this. We know as a coach that you could take an expert rider and you could teach maybe the whole day on a green and blue trail. The green and blue trail aren't beginner intermediate trails. They're just green or blue trails. So I've often thought, like, maybe as trail builders, like, when you're building that blue trail, and this is where the successful blue trails come in, this isn't just an easy trail to make biking easy for the intermediate riders. It's like, how do you build a blue trail for everyone to progress on? And as soon as we take away the label intermediate, it just opens your minds as the trail builders, like, this is just a blue trail. It's not an intermediate trail, it's a blue trail. So what does that mean for a beginner? What does that mean for an expert rider? And then that might help them kind of go into that trail building decision making, right? And even the same for a green trail. get rid of that label beginner. It's just a green trail.
So check this out. I love that. That's a great perspective. Good friend and pro builder legend around these parts, goes by the name Shrimper. And he
what was that name?
Shrimper.
Oh, Shrimper. Right.
Obviously, yeah.
Sorry.
He's Chris Kerr. He and I just built a trail, named it Jumbo Shrimp. It's a blue trail, and
cool.
off the top of Rocky Knob as a alternative to the double black, and it's become the most popular trail at the park. And it takes a lot of effort to get up to it, but the reward, it was just a really cool journey. But anyway, he and I are having these conversations about trail difficulty ratings, and he's a very colorful individual with a lot of sayings. He's like, my new trail rating system is the bullfrog rating system. And I'm like, what does that mean? He's like, well, I'm going to build green trails, and if you're an expert, it's going to be a black. So it's like green on black or black on green, like a bullfrog.
Oh yeah.
And so the whole idea is like, speaking to exactly what you're saying, is like, how can we build trails with the intention of like, this is the green, it's just a green trail, but your advanced rider is going to find the black doubles, the rock to rock or whatever it is on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's always a bit of a challenge with that one, because I kind of think of like, excuse me, like, say you got a green trail. If you don't use the label beginner, well, what label do you use? Because there's certain, I guess, markers that make it a quote unquote beginner trail. One is like, you know this as a trail builder, and I know this from the trail building I've done. It's like, there's going to be a certain grade, there'll be a certain surface, there'll be a certain radius of corners,
width,
a certain width, right? And then there's also an intended speed. Like, you shouldn't really be able to go 60 kilometers an hour on a beginner trail, on a green trail, I should say. Doesn't really make sense given the potential ridership of that trail. So, I mean, I'm just picking a number out of my head, but you get the idea, right? Like, and then a blue trail, maybe it can be a slightly steeper gradient, maybe slightly tighter corners, maybe a slightly rougher surface, maybe a few more obstacles and features now on the blue trail, like some rollers or tabletops, small tabletops, or whatever there might be, some drops. And then again, there'll be like an intended speed range, like not for this area, this type of trail, between, I don't know, 5K an hour and 30K an hour or something. And so on. So I think that becomes what becomes difficult is as soon as you take away the label, say beginner on a green trail, how else do we label it so that trail builders and trail users understand the inherent markers or limitations on that trail? Because what we don't want to do is like take the label away, green trail, we'll take the beginner label away, build it in such a way that you can get people like doing massive doubles or whatever and going really fast, and then they come up on a newer rider, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh my god, there's a trail conflict now because two people are riding the same trail at a massively different speed. But I think that's where the coaching comes in. If the trail builders are coaching, they can see that. They'll see that on the trail. Like, I can make this little double here without necessarily having to go 60K an hour. And so I can stay in kind of the speed range for the trail, but still get fun on it, still get skill development on it, even though I'm a quote unquote expert rider on a green trail.
I think that builders that have that coaching perspective are able to use design to control speed for the intended rider, right? Or
exactly.
the intended.
And how would they do that? Like, just for our listeners, like what would be some examples?
Classically, if you look back in the books, and some of the practices of builders controlling speed was often done through choke points, or bringing things like rocks or trees into the side of the trail to, and doing some sort of zigzag or whatever to.
And you have to slam on your brakes.
Exactly, right. And so that concept has evolved a lot through grade reversals. So large swales up and down to, on a classic flow trail, figuring out what the radius of those are based on the speed that you're wanting, and then using the double at the correct speed so that you're not getting these trail conflicts.
Yeah, so you're not like, because sometimes I see like some what I would label sketchy green trails is when there are these natural doubles or built doubles, but you have to hit them at like 60k an hour. So you have to like cut a corner or sprint in just to make this double. Whereas the safe greens, there's little natural doubles everywhere. But I don't, as an expert rider on a green trail, to throw some labels in, I don't necessarily need to suddenly like sprint, but I can see it and just, hey, I'm just going to pop up here. And, oh, that was fun. Little double there, or manual through that, or nose bonk that roller.
Well, talk for a second, Paul, about, coaching more advanced riders on something like Del Boca Vista or Ho Chi Minh, those green trails. Like, why?
Green trails in Whistler Bike Park. I mean, one thing Whistler Bike Park has always done really well is understood the synergy between trail building and coaching, because they've had a bike school since pretty much day one, and the trail builders and the bike school work pretty closely together. And people often kind of hail Whistler Bike Park as like, best bike park in the world, and it's the example to follow, and they're right, because it is incredible. But it's not just the trail building for the sake of building really good trails. What makes the trails so good is they're so good to coach on, which means they're so good to learn on. Whether you're in a mountain bike lesson or not, it's irrelevant. You make a trail that's good for coaching, it's going to be good for learning. And how have they done that? They've created pullouts so you can rest halfway down. Simple stuff like that. Or create a pullout so you can stop and just watch some riders do a certain section. Obviously, if you're coaching, you can just pull your group out to the side. So it's a really easy, simple thing like pullouts will suddenly transform a trail into making it easier to learn on. And you haven't changed the trail. You've just moved some space off to the side so a rider can stop and not stop in the middle of the trail. Now that trail's safer for everyone. And it also happens for us as coaches. It's easier to coach on as well. So that's just one example. And then the other thing they've done is just nail in the progression. So you talk about Del Boca Vista and some of the green trails. There's some pros and cons to the trail. But what have they done with it? Well, the obstacles are fairly small and minor. I'd call it a dark green if we're technical.
Sure, yeah.
Like it's not like, it's sort of a dark green, light blue. It blends between the two. But yeah, it's not very steep. There are a few tight corners on it, which kind of makes it more of a blue than a green. There's not any obstacle or trail surface that's too big or too loose or too sketchy. So I would class it as like a dark green technical single track downhill trail. And so my son, for example, he first rode down that when he was 6, I think, or 7, on his little bike. And that gives you an idea. I've taken novice riders down there for their kind of first taste of technical single track trails. So we're really using that trail for a whole gamut of riders, from like kids to adults to sort of strong beginners, all the way up to, junior youth development teams that are racing on the BC Cup. So that's just an example of understanding how a green trail isn't necessarily just a beginner trail. And I think of another good example in Rotorua when I was teaching out there in New Zealand. And my wife we had the kids at the time. So she was riding around this green trail with the chariot, with the 2 kids in the back of the chariot. and a run bike hanging off the handlebar of the chariot. And she was riding around this green trail. So obviously there's some good width, right? And then I was riding around, but I was just lapping them. So it was kind of a loop trail. And I was just laughing. There's all these mellow rollers. I was trying to sort of manual between them, or manual sort of 2-3 rollers in a row, trying to pump without pedaling. I was just giggling around on this green trail, but I wasn't going crazy fast. I didn't really need to make the features kind of flow together. And then my wife was literally riding around with the kids in a chariot on the back. I mean, that has always stuck out to me as like, that's the perfect green trail where anyone can use it. Speeds are limited to a certain range. I think that's where, if you can, as a trail builder, if you can understand the perspective of who's going to be riding it, you're going to create a much more successful trail. Like, I sometimes flip it around. Like, what are some things I see on green trails that don't make green trails successful? Well, one is really narrow. You might have like a smooth surface, nothing too technical, corners might be a good radius, but it's super narrow. And that can be really intimidating for a brand new rider because they're finding it hard to balance. And for a brand new rider, it will kind of feel like a skinny. And I've seen that a lot of green trails that are just a little bit rocky, a little bit rough on the surface. And if it was just a foot wider or 2 feet wider, it would be a brilliant green trail. But because it's a little bit rocky, but it's so narrow, students are just really nervous on it. The other thing I see is just really boring green trails that almost panders too much. Like, if you could build a green trail with just very mellow banked corners, it's not even a berm. It just gives the newer rider a bit more confidence, especially on loose terrain. And you can actually start talking to them about like a banked corner versus a flat corner. It's actually useful for coaching. But then obviously a rider that has a little more speed is going to have more fun on that green trail. So it's a win-win from both ends, And then I'll see green trails that are just super flat and there's nothing in there, like a little roller or maybe even just a curb drop, like 6 inches. You don't have to do anything, but they get to feel a plonk plonk as the bike rolls over it. So if the green trail is nice and wide, but it's really flat and boring, well, yeah, it's safe, but that's hard to coach on because there's nothing really to use there. It's harder to coach on, and it's not really engaging either. The classic one I see on blue trails is gap jumps.
Oh, yeah.
Where like the jumps aren't big, they're quite a good shape, they're quite a good size, but they're just not tabletops. And there's just no reason to have gap jumps on a blue trail, because I think gap jumps is the perfect example where like understand how people learn, how they progress, how they manage risk, how they deal with fear. Like very few riders are going to want to hit a gap jump, but a gap jump, the same shape and size as a tabletop, is technically no different. It requires the same skill sets. It's just got a higher risk and a smaller margin of error. I always think gap jump's the perfect example. Like a well-built blue trail should have small to medium tabletop jumps, nothing too big, nothing too steep, but they should just still be all tables. And then for the expert rider, it doesn't change the jump. It's the same for us. It's actually even more fun because now I can manual over the top or nose manual or nose bonk. I can actually get more skill development on a blue trail with tabletops than I can with a blue trail with gap jumps. I get trail building, gap jumps are easier to build because you need less dirt. I totally get that. But a lot of the time I'll be in places and there isn't a reason why they have to be gap jumps. There's enough dirt around, it's easily accessible. They've built it with a machine anyway, a lot of the time. So you're like, you had the machine, you've got the dirt, just make it a tabletop.
Well, I think that speaks to builders need to ask the question, who's this for? Who's this? Is this for me and my buddies in only advanced riders, or is it for somebody else? The other thing that I like to see, and seeing a lot more of this, is, speaking of jumps, even on blue trails, is really forgiving landers.
longer landings, softer
very soft
knuckles.
knuckles. Canugas are a really good example of this, where they've got these massive elongated, landings with just these broad knuckles. And so you see people are going there really to learn to jump, because it's a place where you can feel very confident very quickly, whether you're sending it to the landing or not.
Yeah. The other one I see on jump trails is frequency. So that would be defined as like the number of jumps between A and B. And say you've got, I don't know, 100 feet or whatever, you have a trail with 6 jumps in 100 feet, or a trail with 3 or 4 jumps in 100 feet. And the latter trail is going to have more time to recover between the features. So I remember there was a bike park in Australia that I was consulting for, and I've done a bunch of consulting for bike parks and clubs around the world. And that's quite a common one, where I'll see like the jump size was pretty good. The jumps weren't that big. I would kind of class them as like a medium jump, maybe sort of 10 to 15 feet from kind of lip to knuckle, nothing too huge. But on the bigger size of a blue jump trail, the lips were a little steep, but they weren't too bad, like the ramps. But it was literally like land, jump. Like you would land, pump straight into the next ramp. And then there were like some hips and stuff as well. So I was there for a week and I still hadn't quite cleaned it smoothly. I mean, I was getting it, but it wasn't pretty, right? I was still a little bit in survival mode. Yeah, so that was a good example of a couple of those trail builders were actually doing the instructor course that week. And after I left, they just reworked a whole bunch of trails because they suddenly started to see it through other people's eyes.
I think maybe to start wrapping this up a bit, that's a really interesting idea of like seeing the trail through someone else's eyes, and realizing that if we're just building and seeing things as a builder, we may be building for us or for people that we think are going to use the trail. Like expand your sense of awareness to how's this going to look from a novice perspective. We see this here. No matter what you do, signage wise, structure wise, qualifier wise, like if somebody wants to try to ride a trail, they're gonna find themselves on it. And
so, what would you say to your fellow trail builders out there? Like, if they want to learn more about different ability levels, different riders, how other riders perceive terrain or learning or skill progression, like what would you say to them? What would you have them do? Where would you have them go? What could be some ideas for the trail builders to help build their their awareness?
I think some low-hanging fruit there would be to sign up for a coaching session from a local coach, and just go through a 2 to 3 hour skills progression, and observe it from the perspective of being coached, and what kinds of ideas that might lead to from a trail building perspective as well. I think ideally, like a trail builder takes a PMBI course, and really looks at the whole 6 skill system, and starts to see the big picture. I think it'd be something very, very, very empowering.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I was thinking as a low-hanging fruit is just go volunteer. Just go spend some time with a kids program, or a beginner program, or a weekend camp. Just go spend some time shadowing, and maybe just volunteering as a tail guide, and just get hours watching people learn, and just get hours watching people ride on different trails. And I think that's probably and then if they bite the bug and this is kind of fun, I quite like helping out, and maybe I'll take an instructor course myself, right? Like whether that's PMBIA or a different instructor course, it doesn't really matter. They can just get out there and do a course. But I think that's a good place to start. It's like volunteering. And I think a nice way to flip the conversation around is let's look at coaches for a second, just before we wrap up, like you mentioned. But why should coaches build trails? Because this is a key thing that, like, I'm really big on with my team here in Whistler. We do a bunch of, we support Walker, and we help out with trail nights. We sponsor trail nights. Some of our coaches just work on trails on their own. I've done a bunch of trail work myself as a paid and volunteer trail builder here in Whistler and back in the UK, and then built a bunch of trails in North Carolina. So for me, like, coaching and trail building have always been something I've done. Obviously, I've done a lot more coaching than trail building because that's my profession. But why should coaches build trails? How's that going to help them, whether it's their business or whether it's help them in their coaching? Like, let's flip it around.
Yeah, for sure. I like that. I think that, to me, the starting point is understanding the process of what goes into the creation of the trail, and seeing the individual components of how that trail functions, from the tread to, I mean, the all the environmental pieces that go in, but also like from feature to feature. I think especially if you're working or volunteering with a organization that has a keen eye for creative trails, exciting trails, you're going to learn a lot about that interaction. Yeah, and I think it helps round out that awareness and seeing the big picture, right? And seeing what is the relationship between me, the coach, not just the trail and the skills involved, but like everything behind the scene that we don't know about, right? And then also, I think reasons coaches should get involved with building trails is the concept of stewardship and the idea of giving back, and it rounds out like this community we have, or this industry that we have of people. It's like we're all in this together. Like, as coaches, we need trails. The trail builders need people to ride them. We're all on the same team. How can we support and complement each other? I think
that's where I really believe it's a synergy, it's a loop, it's a feedback loop.
Totally.
Right? Coaches really help break the entry barrier down, and they help invite more people to the sport, which in turn, in theory, can create more support, more funding for trails, which obviously feeds into trail building jobs, trail building wages, opportunities for more trail building. So the like we kind of said at the start of the podcast today, like, if those two sides, the builders and the coaches, can come together, that's where that loop is formed. And it's not a linear conversation from one person to another person. Now it's a circular conversation between a community, and each little piece is helping each other. I think the other reason why coaches should build trails is they wouldn't be coaching without the trails.
Right.
Like you said, like, you're only there because someone built the trails. So why don't you go like help them as well? Because at that point you're on the trail, so someone has helped you, right? So now you want to give back. Okay, I'm coaching on this trail. I want to give back. I want to see if I can help them build the trail. But I think also, like you said, with stewardship, just from a business and operations point of view, like this is probably another podcast in itself, but just real quick, like, if you're a coach or you're a coaching company and you're operating on trails, it's inherent. It is implied that your business is thriving or surviving, or your coaching is happening because of those trails.
One of our goals of this podcast is that we hope to inspire thought amongst our listeners for all these topics. And we really hope that if you're a coach or a builder, that this has been inspiring you to think about other ways to see your practice, whether it's building a trail or coaching your riders. So hopefully you've gained something there. Donut of the day. Let's jump right into that.
Donut. Yeah, donut of the day.
So
Well, I'm hoping if they listen to last week's episode, we did pina colada donuts, which is a favorite of mine and Whistler. But what you've got one for today? What's the donut
I
of the
do.
day?
Did you ever have, when you're in North Carolina, a Krispy Kreme donut straight from a Krispy Kreme location? So my donut of the day is just going to start with the classic Krispy Kreme glazed donut.
But when the light's on, like
when the light's on. So for our listeners not from North Carolina, the Krispy Kreme store has a light that says fresh hot now. And when that light is on, that means those donuts have come right off the donut line.
The sacred light.
The sacred light. And it's the experience of if you get a Krispy Kreme right off the line in the store, like the phrase melts in your mouth, it doesn't even quite, it just kind of disappears. It's like it absorbed into your being.
My favorite thing about those is you can just eat more of them. Because they basically just disappear.
They disappear, but you know, back to your comment about donuts are good for you, good for your health. I mean,
obviously,
the happiness of a fresh Krispy Kreme, it can't be measured.
Especially with a coffee. I like those fresh ones with a drip coffee.
Yeah. Pro tip: if you find a Krispy Kreme, at a grocery store, or around here they do fundraisers, and so kids will be selling them for whatever. You got to put those things in the microwave.
Yeah.
It's a shame to eat. Like you gotta eat a fresh, hot Krispy
Sacrilege. Awesome, bud. Well, that's a great way to end this week. Go get a fresh Krispy Kreme.
Yes. All right. We'll see everybody back here on our next episode.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show and that it sparked some ideas for your writing and your coaching. As always, our approach to coaching is on pros and cons, not rights and wrongs. And with that in mind, our podcast is meant to be more of a conversation about topics and techniques rather than a final say in how to ride or how to teach. As always, please take care if using or applying any of the techniques discussed in this podcast. Stay safe, ride smart, and we'll see you next time.